It was Ian McLaren, former chairman of Tesco, used to say that doing nothing is the biggest risk of all. Look at the growth of Shein and TikTok Shop and Temu. Basking in the sun is no longer a long-term strategy for many firms. You have to be agile. You have to be really thinking ahead, much more so than just managing a staple business model, tweaking operational efficiencies on a day-to-day basis. How do you radically change the business when you're in the middle of a race with increasingly bitter competition?
You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello and welcome to Retail Disrupted. Today, we're speaking to one of the world's leading academic experts on retail. Jonathan Reynolds is an associate professor in retail marketing and deputy dean at Said Business School at the University of Oxford. He joins us today to talk about his book, Navigating the New Retail Landscape, and also the forces that are reshaping retail across stores, screens, and everything in between. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Natalie. Great to be here.
No, it's great to have you here. And we have a lot to get into. But before we start talking shop, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do at Oxford?
Yeah, so I'm rather an odd fish. I started off as a geographer, of all things, did a geography degree. And of course, at the time, retailing was an obvious career move because it was all about location, and it still is to some extent. But I kind of meandered via a planning degree and then a PhD in geography, but focusing on retail. And my supervisor was a guy called Professor Ross Davis at Newcastle University. And he was working at the time with Tesco through Ian McLaren on what was then called teleshopping, which is a very odd and rather bizarre kind of concept, which involved large TV sets in old people's homes in Gateshead, having Tesco goods delivered. One of the first experiments in e-commerce, if you like. And that's what got me into technology and retail. That's what got me into grocery retailing as an interest. And I suppose I've spent the last 40 years just thinking about the way in which retailing has evolved. I moved down to Oxford in the mid-'80s, and my doctoral supervisor set up a research centre on retail. And we were there in the early days of the sector's professionalisation. We were working with companies like Marks & Spencer, Next, Sainsbury's, with the very first almost generation of non-family members, if you like, working in the business and seeking to professionalize those businesses and scale them and so on. It's a really exciting time to be working with those firms. I've kind of ended up within a business school, which seems rather odd. But because you can't have geographers in business schools, I'm actually in the marketing section of the school. But we have a research centre still on retail, and that's my main interest.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating sector, isn't it? And we're going to get into all of the disruption in just a moment. But first, I'd like to ask you about your book and specifically what prompted the need for a third edition. And I kind of know the answer to this, and it's probably a big question.
You've been there too, Natalie, with your great book on Amazon. As soon as you write something, the day after, someone rings you up and says, we just invented this last night. Why didn't you talk about it? It's not a kind of it's a work in progress, continuous work in progress in some respects.
Definitely. Well, I remember when it came to writing the second edition for the Amazon book, we were told, you only need 20 to 30% new content. And I thought, you can't rewrite a book about Amazon with just 20% new content. We basically rewrote the book.
That's right. And I mean, to answer your question, I think 3 editions. So it was 2016, 2021, and 2025. And I should fess up that it is not just my book. It's my great colleague and friend, Alan Treadgold, who's co-author. And he had a very similar origin to me as a doctoral student at Newcastle University, but he went the practice route and I went the academic route. So the combination of the skill sets has proved really useful. But the third edition, our first edition, I suppose, in 2016 was when you might say retail moved from denial to reluctant acceptance that there might be more than stores, and we could see this kind of sort of dawning realization amongst the big firms. They couldn't just call the e-commerce operation store 99, in terms of revenue. The 2021 edition was a COVID edition. We were very bored working from home. We thought, gosh, this is really interesting. So we rather like you said, rewrote a good half of the book, thinking about the implications of COVID. 2025, though, I think what really struck us was not just the transformation in progress, but where some of the innovation was to be found. And there was this historic preoccupation with the US as a source of innovation in retail. Frankly, it's a bus flush. Most of the new and interesting stuff is in Asia and has been for a number of years, in China and in South Korea and Japan. And that's where many of the case studies are based. And we've been working with NTT Data in Japan on the third edition, which is going to be actually also translated to Japanese, which is quite fun. It's much more representative, if you like, of global innovation in the retail sector.
Interesting. And so I do want to come back to that because I know you've included a lot of case studies, and I think there's lots to kind of unpack there. But first, I'd like to talk about transformation more generally, because I think in our industry, I think one thing everybody agrees on is that the only constant is change, and it's a sector that's always evolving. It's fast paced. But I think we would also agree that over the past 5 years, we've really seen an acceleration in the pace of change. And today, for me, it feels like we're in this era of perpetual disruption, geopolitical, economic, tech, new forms of competition popping up. So lots happening. But what, in your view, makes the current transformation in retail fundamentally different from previous periods of change?
I think it's probably the focus on the consumer. I mean, whenever you get a retailer up to talk about what they do, they talk about the consumer. Sometimes I think it's become rhetoric rather than reality, and I think consumers have much more power, much more choice than they used to. So the transformation, as you say, is a polycrisis, is the sort of current phrasing for this, geopolitical, supply chain, economic pressures, cost of living, new channels to market, new competition, new business models, you name it. It's in play.
It's all happening.
It's all happening. And if you're a leader, you're kind of thinking, how do I just keep up with what's going on in the world? I mean, just watching the debate from Davos today, thinking, my God, what's the implications for supply chains and all this? What it comes down to is the consumer. I think ultimately the retail firm, wherever it is located, in space or virtually or through formats, is in the service of the consumer, and the consumer has the power to change their mind. And you may look at the growth of Shein and TikTok Shop and Temu to know that basking in the sun is no longer a kind of long-term strategy for many firms. You have to be agile. You have to be really thinking ahead, much more so than just sort of stable, managing a stable business model, tweaking operational efficiencies on a day-to-day basis. It's a much more radical mindset that you need to have.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on Temu, Shein, TikTok, and they very much feature in my notes for today's discussion. I'd like to hone in on this in a little bit more detail. So I'd love to get your take on the extent to which technology is the main driver in all this change. So yes, we've just touched on some of the disruptors. We've got AI. I mean, we haven't even touched on AI yet. Whole big topic, and things like agentic commerce coming in. But also we've got the digitization of physical retail. And so tech is really revolutionizing, I think, the way that we shop and connecting those experiences, physical and digital, in a much more seamless, much more personalized way. Yeah. But there's other things happening too. So I'd love to get your take.
Okay, so the technology piece for me is a bit of a, it tends to attract maximum attention. It's the technology, but it's a catalyst, but it's not the whole story, it seems to me. The real transformation comes in how that technology reshapes consumer behavior, consumer expectations, and it's also to do with how retailers think of that technology. If they think of it for its own sake, then they're more likely to fail. If they think of it in terms of how it enables or facilitates interaction with the consumer, better interaction with the consumer than the competitor, then perhaps, or produces more efficient supply chains and less out of stocks and so on, towards an end, technology too often are sort of solutions in search of problems, it seems to me. And you see so many kind of bright ideas that you say, well, what problem are you trying to solve here? Oh, well, no, I mean, it's just this great, look at this, isn't this cool? Look what it can do. You think, but how does that kind of improve my operational efficiency? How does it improve the way I engage with consumers? How does it improve the way I personalize my offer to consumers? And if you can't answer some of those questions, and you can't see how to effectively integrate your technology into your existing business processes, then I think you have a problem as a retailer.
Yeah, it's very, I think, tempting to just get the next shiny thing. There's a lot of talk about AI and how it's like
toy syndrome,
shiny new things. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, is everything has to be done with the customer in mind. And if, you look at the best retailers out there, they always start with the customer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about physical retail, because this is an interesting space? Because if we rewind 5 to 6 years ago, say mid-pandemic, stores were closed, we had to shop online. I think there was this sense that that was really going to be an inflection point for
Yeah.
e-commerce.
Yeah.
But as we all know, as soon as we were allowed to get back into stores, we did. So I think that surprised some people. I think it surprised some analysts. I think it surprised some retailers who had spent a lot of money on fulfillment and investing in e-commerce more generally. But I think to kind of build on your last point, I think it should also serve as a reminder that tech is great and it can definitely enhance the in-store experience, take the friction out, make it more personalized. But it's never going to replace the in-store experience. And I think that's also probably why we're seeing a lot of online retailers moving into the physical space as well.
Yeah.
So what's your take on this, Jonathan? What's the role of the store in the digital era?
Yeah. I mean, you're right to say that during COVID times, everyone was making exponential forecasts. The store is dead and so on. And I remember looking at the first data points that came back after the past pandemic, and we were all engaging in revenge shopping, and people say that won't last. It's just a rebound. People want to get out more. And it did last. And the queues around the Oxford Westgate Centre waiting to get to Primark on the first day after the pandemic reopening, were extraordinary. But going beyond that, when you looked at the data, certainly for the UK, the US, and Asia, you saw this blip for penetration of e-commerce maxing out at about 50, 60%. But then you saw it bounce back. And if you draw a line, it's still on the long-term trend. It bounced back to almost where it had been, or where it would have been, a year or so into the future. What has changed a little bit, probably, certainly in the UK, for example, is the online food retail thing. That bounced up around about from 6% to 12% of penetration, and it stayed there. So the non-food has bounced back. The food has kind of increased, but is nowhere near where it was in the pandemic. So the role of the store, I think is what we can say. It's no longer primarily a place of transactions. Its value increasingly lies in experience and reassurance, fulfillment, brand expression. It's the local representation of the brand. It's where you go if you want immediate satisfaction, don't want to pay £300 for a pint of milk through a Q-commerce op. I think what you see is that sector by sector, slightly different trade-offs, but everywhere you go, you see stores still in existence, thank God, because that's where we get some of our social kicks, as well as just sitting on the bed with our friends doing Shein, But there's increasing pressure on those stores to better represent the brand in a physical way. So they're not the only kid in town, if you like, anymore, and haven't been for many years, But so there's an increased emphasis on the performance of that space. Seeing now, I think retailers thinking very carefully about space productivity, but also about experience, and the dreadful E word, experiential, is trotted out at every occasion. I mean, experiential is fine, but it's damn expensive to keep the consumer happy. They've been round this great new exhibition once, or the roller skate alley that you've invented. They've done it once. Why would they want to do it again? What's the next innovation you're going to have in your store? So the kind of the tolerance for new ideas and the sort of speed of acceptance of those moves so rapidly. It's actually quite expensive to do proper experiential work, but for some sectors, it's essential. So it's a varied response.
I think it's interesting because it's easy if you're a store like Selfridges, where actually you have a relatively small portfolio of stores, and shoppers expect that, and there's a luxury, a surprise and delight factor as well. But for most high street stores, just it's not practical. And
That's right.
I think it's also interesting because my take on physical retail is that you need to save your customers time or enhance it. Which, to your point around experiential and giving shoppers something that they can't get from a screen, I think is becoming so important.
And it's complementary. So I remember seeing some early John Lewis department store figures that said, whenever they opened a department store in a place, online sales in that area would also increase. So it's a linked experience. People, in a sense, people really don't care where you're represented, provided they can get what they want through the channels that are available to them. And if you're not on that channel, then you may lose the sale because you break that link in the chain of research through to trying to buying to after sales service and so on. So people think of the whole experience almost as sort of channel neutral to some extent, provided they can satisfy their needs.
Yeah, I think most shoppers are channel agnostic. They're device agnostic. They don't, we're the ones that think in channels. Retailers are the
Oh
ones
yeah,
that think in channels, right?
it's a really old-fashioned. We need to get out of that habit. I used to find my MBA students for ones that mentioned omni-channel, class. But
I love that. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to go back to something you just talked about, which was fashion and food and e-commerce, and how, I agree. I think those are the two categories that have generally been slower to transition online for all the obvious reasons, right? We still want to try clothes on. There's the whole sizing and fit issue.
And the service element in the high-end luxury market is really important as part of the brand and so on.
Definitely. But I'm just wondering, I know AI is a big topic, but I just wonder, as we look to the future, do you think, I guess my take, especially with grocery e-commerce, is that if a pandemic can't drive grocery e-commerce adoption, then I don't know what can. But I would caveat that with maybe AI. Maybe AI can help us take the chore out of grocery shopping. And then we also have things like quick commerce. So I'd love to just get your take on where you see that, how you see e-commerce evolving in the future.
Let's think about grocery and e-commerce, because I think they're different answers for different sectors. I mean, I walk around our local Sainsbury's superstore, doing my own shopping and family shopping as well as professionally. And I always keep an eye open on the sort of demographics of people who are still queuing at the checkouts with massive trolleys of goods, rather than do the in-store scanning or the sort of self-scan sort of mechanisms. And there are still a demand for checkout solutions, because you'll have a chat with the person behind the counter. But the demographics tend to be much older, the sort of young professionals whipping through the store scan sort of service and so on. I have to say, my wife is not a keen fan of self-scan, so she will queue up with the rest. But it says horses for courses. You have to offer those choices, otherwise you lose part of your demographic. I think the e-commerce thing is really interesting. My village is a classic Cotswold village. We see every grocery delivery van brand through the village on a Sunday. Or on a Friday evening. I mean, there's a constant flow of Ocado, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Waitrose vans going past us, so there is a clear demand for home delivery. There's equally this demand for click and collect. And so the demographics are very different for each of these models, and of course it's in retailers' interests to try and reduce the actual cost of the delivery component whilst maintaining price levels, independent of channel. And that's always a big challenge. So moving people back towards click and collect, because it saves sending the van out, is a desirable sort of route. And the French solution, Le Drive, is actually a great sort of dominant. The Drive is a dominant model. Which I suspect many UK retailers wish it was here, because it's not as loss making as home delivery. But
I guess it doesn't work here. Sorry to interrupt, but I guess do you think it doesn't work here because of how densely populated it is in the UK versus France?
I think so. There are different geography, different distribution, and so on. I think there's probably a slightly higher service element to French grocery retailing historically than it's been in the UK. So self-service was a bit anathema in France, and so going to get someone to put it in the boot for you, is actually an acceptable kind of trade-off. Having said that, as I think what really struck me was that growth in the UK from 6% to 12%, which stuck. So there's clearly a demand.
But it's still only 12%.
But it's only 12%. And how far it gets beyond that, you could see in the pandemic, people were forced to think about online. What didn't they like about it? Well, perhaps it was the minimum spend. Perhaps it was the lack of effective substitutes. Perhaps it was the mistakes made in the order. Perhaps the delivery drivers scowled when they delivered it. I don't know. But it could be all kinds of reasons why they then reverted to conventional stores afterwards. I think this does go to say that even in grocery, where you'd think actually the regularity and the consistency of the shopping pattern, the things you buy every day, every week, you'd want to get those things, particularly staples, rather than fresh food and so on. You could automate that and be happy with that. But clearly, that isn't a dominant view in the UK, at least. It isn't in China, but.
Yeah. So maybe this is a good time to bring in, you mentioned at the start that a lot of the innovation is coming from Asia. So could you talk us through sort of what you're seeing and what you've included in your book?
Yeah. So what struck us from a number of years, I think, is that many European retailers used to trek off to the US to see the latest in retailing, and they come back with sort of tell about disappointment. Why aren't loyalty schemes more established in the US, and why is this technology so clunky, and why do they still cut checks and this kind of stuff? I remember the first time I went to the States, it took me 3 months to get a bank account. I had to drive to some small town in New Hampshire to register for a social security number, that sort of thing. So it's not as slick as it's often cut out to be. What always struck me in particularly China, but also I think just in Japan and South Korea and other parts of Southeast Asia, is just the passion, enthusiasm, speed of change, and the willingness to try stuff. If it doesn't work, leave it. So try and make it work. If it fails, move on. That carries with it a risk for established firms. I was reading about Meituan just last week, which is always the sort of poster child of drone deliveries and so on, being threatened again by Alibaba, who have ramped up what on earth is effect loss-making quick commerce deliveries in China, and eating Meituan's lunch. So what actually happens, I think, is that although there's fantastic innovation, there is also fantastic competition. And so the margins are extraordinarily tight, if even existent, but companies like Alibaba and so are willing to experiment, willing to innovate. They tried 12 new formats out in the last couple of years, abandoned 10 of them.
Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So there's a great, if I do sort of promotion, there's a great little tech consultancy in Belgium called TechBuzz, which does focuses on China in particular, and has some great insights into the latest developments in Chinese retailing. But the last time I was there, just end of last year, I was trying to pay with my face in Alibaba supermarket, and one of the Fresh Hippo supermarkets. And I couldn't work out why it wouldn't accept my facial features, because I'd registered on WeChat and so on, got my bank account all sorted out. I was so disappointed. This poor lady who didn't speak any English was trying to help me with my face, to pay for these goods. In the end, I realized that actually I was in a competitor store. WeChat is not owned by Alibaba; it's owned by somebody else, and they don't recognize each other. And so I had to go queue up and pay cash with all the other old men, basically. The fantastic innovation, fantastic rollout of stuff. The speed of innovation is amazing. The rollout of AI, I think, is extraordinary. I think some of it's pretty crude and not necessarily worked through, but if they get it right, it's going to be tremendous. The work on robotics combination with AI is equally impressive. So I think there's some fantastic exemplars there, and we talk about those in the book. We have over 30 case studies, and probably about a third of those are Asian, to do with the way in which technology has been integrated into the organization, to do with consumer reactions to the retail brands in those markets.
And what about the kind of culture that you need to transform digitally? Because, you touched on agility and failing fast. For me, I think curiosity is another big part of this. And I just had the former global president for ice cream at Unilever on the podcast, and he really drove home the point about not punishing risk. So encouraging, again, I guess it's sort of fast failure. Don't punish risk, keep trying new things. Yeah. And I think if you look at a big legacy retailer like Marks and Spencer, for example, I remember last year at the Retail Technology Show, Archie Norman, the chair of M&S, got on stage and said, you need to fracture the culture. So if it's not working and you're a big legacy retailer, you really have to make these changes. You break it. Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's right. And Zim McLaren, former chairman of Tesco, used to say that doing nothing is the biggest risk of all. And he was so right. That the challenge is doing these radical things. He also said was like changing the engine in the middle of a race. It's quite tough to do business as usual because you can't stop. You've always got to be open. Always got to be at the customer's discretion. Always got to be in stock. How do you radically change the business when you're in the middle of a race with increasingly kind of bitter competition in particular sectors? So I think it is about coming down to culture. I think what's happened in M&S over the last 2 or 3 years is very indicative of how that culture has been broken and changed. And there's a whenever I go into an M&S store, there is this great optimism. amongst the staff. Just fantastic. My local Simply Food store in Chipping Norton, they are so friendly. They are so, I mean, they were devastated with the cyber attack, for example, and they were so apologetic and, so supportive of the head office colleagues who were basically sleeping on the floor 24 hours a day, in the office trying to sort this stuff out. That you really felt you wanted to support them as a customer. You wanted to come back and make sure they still had a job the next week. So that customer facing culture is just as important as the transformational change culture. Because transformational change can be scary. For example, store based employees. What does it mean for me? Is always the question that you have to put in your head for any organization that's going through change, whether it's a business school or a retailer. It's everyone's first question is, what does this mean for me? And if you don't have a good answer to that, then you're going to seed anxiety and fear and disillusionment and lack of motivation throughout the organization.
Yeah, that's interesting. And just to kind of, I do want to come back to store staff and sort of where you see retail jobs going, because we touched on automation as well. There's so much happening. I think my brain is very buzzy and full. Luckily, I have my notes in front of me. But one thing, just to go back to M&S, that I know Stuart Macon has said is that they are positively dissatisfied. That's how they describe kind of their culture now. And I love that, because having written the book about it is. And I think, whenever anybody asks me about Amazon and just can you, in one line, why have they been so successful? It's because they have a relentless dissatisfaction with the status quo. That is the brief kind of elevator pitch. That in a nutshell is why I think they've been so successful. And I think there's
they also tolerate failure.
Tolerate
failure. So if you look at the number of patents that they've got and the ideas that have not made the grade, for various reasons, they're tolerant of failure in some of their innovations. And that's a US attitude more than a European attitude. In Europe, we sometimes think, well, gosh, if you've been involved in a failed project, then that's it, end of life. Whereas in some senses, if you failed in the US, that's a sign of having been burnt in the fire and survived, and moved on to the next challenge. So I think there is a bit of a kind of organizational cultural difference between some of the regional markets in this respect.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes from Jeff Bezos, having written the book and done a lot of research, as I'm sure you know, he talks about innovation and failure being inseparable twins. And I love that. I think there's a lot to learn.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think many, many more firms could learn from that example. I think traditional retail firms were unwilling to see the status quo change. Hence my earlier remark about in 2016 that this notion that moving from denial to reluctant acceptance of e-commerce. And I remember even then, some firms were still calling it Store 99. And this is this strange little thing that goes on in the background, and it'll amount to very much. And if Argos's first sale was a mug rack or something, that's about it. That's as far as we'll go. And I remember, Lord Rayner, M&S, used to say, well, it might be great for selling underpants, but not for much else. We'll never sell fashion on email, on e-commerce.
Never say never.
Never say never.
Yeah, really interesting, especially in hindsight. It's a lot of change. I do want to talk about retail jobs, though, because we talked about how the role of the store is evolving. So clearly, the role of the store associate is also going to have to evolve. And I'd love to get your take. What does the future of work look like if you are a frontline retail employee?
I think it again does vary by sector, but overall, I'd say the future store employee is less of a kind of cashier and more of an advisor, a brand ambassador. I mean, these guys at M&S and Chipping Norton, they just love they just love working there. I arrive unseasonably early at 8:00 on a Saturday morning when they just opened, and they hate me because the aisles are full of. They're trying to restock the shelves, and I get in the way of my trolley and so on. But they are so sweet, genuine about wanting to. If you found anything you need, there's a wonderful Chinese lady who's often on the checkout who says at least 5 times, "Are you sure I can't help you with your packing?" So no, it's fine. Really, it's great, and that is so meaningful in terms of building brand loyalty. So going from the transactional culture to relational culture, I think that's not easy. Not everyone is good at it. But equally at that store, there are kind of the teenage guys and gals, doing summer jobs or weekend jobs who are pretty impressive, at 17 and 18, being able to kind of hold their own in a good conversation about what you're doing this weekend, kind of thing. And that really gives me hope for the qualities and the skills that are required. I mean, I think certainly place will matter less for access to goods, but more for things like meaning, trust, and engagement. And frankly, AI is not great at that. So people are, basically. So a premium on social skills, relational skills, a premium on certainly, even in stores, kind of better data knowledge and capability, perhaps amongst certain groups. But there's no substitute for an effective advisor, curator, if you like, in the store.
And how do you think technology might enhance that? Because something I talk about a lot is tech-enabled human touch. So marrying up technology with the social skills that you just touched on, and the human aspect. And I think in this AI digital first world, we are going to be craving, what AI and what technology can't give us, which is that those human skills. So how do you see that?
I think it's a colleague of mine who works in the area of AI and media entertainment, Alex Connick, and he's written a couple of great books on the subject. And one of his observations is that we've seen almost a reaction to Spotify and on-screen gaming and so on, with a real rebirth of live entertainment and experience. And I think we may see the same thing in the technology and people in retail. That actually technology will give us the efficiency, it'll give us, but it's pretty soulless stuff, unless you've kind of married your AI avatar or whatever it is, even then it's a bit dodgy. But I think, we should look at the glass half full opportunity here, which is that it relieves many store employees and colleagues of routine tasks and gives over time for non-routine tasks, like just passing the time of day with customers, checking they're all right, building relationship rather than worrying about who's stealing what or whether the shelf is full at the moment because the camera can automatically reorder. So I think that it's a kind of a shifting of the boundary between routine and non-routine for the human employee. And of course, when you get into head office, into specialist functions, the human role is equally important because you can't just allow the AI to run untrammeled. Autonomy is great, but it could produce some really quite difficult and painful outcomes if it gets it wrong. So again, routine, non-routine split, leaving more time for the creative side and the kind of human side of the process, and transferring across the routine tasks to the AI. And that trade-off will move, I think, a little bit, but for all we see, AI is producing fake Monets and classical paintings and so on. You can usually tell a fake, an inauthentic experience. You get the authentic one from the human being at the moment. Come back to me for this 10th edition in a few years' time. Perhaps I'll be an avatar. We already have Alex Connick, my colleague, already has an AI avatar that he uses in the classroom that teaches in Mandarin and Arabic.
Really? Wow. And that's actually very useful, isn't it?
It is, but not least because he can't speak Arabic, so it's very helpful.
That is interesting because we hear about the potential for AI and all the opportunities, and I think some are maybe more concrete than others. But just to build on something you just said around one of the risks with AI, something that I'm hearing about, because obviously the short-term benefit of AI for retail teams is just as you said, it's about that immediate access to information, taking away, automating some of the processes, and allowing staff to focus on those higher value customer facing tasks. However, if we get too dependent on it, there is a risk of cognitive complacency. And that's something I'm hearing more and more retailers starting to think about, that we don't want to lose the ability to think critically.
I mean, there's a great question to ask of an Oxford academic, because our whole approach to learning is about the critical spirit and critical inquiry. That's what has built this place over 900 years. And being the conscience of the organization, monitoring the outputs of the automation, There's a great science fiction story where I think everyone gets sacked apart from one person who is the conscience of the organization, whose job it is to make sure the AI doesn't make any mistakes, or doesn't do things stupid like maximize production paper clips or whatever. It's a rather scary kind of prognosis, but it does hold some truth in it, which is that you need someone to, or you need a skill set as an individual manager within a retail firm or a leader in a retail firm to ask those critical questions. How do we know this? How do we get there? What are the assumptions this has made to get to this conclusion? What are the alternatives? What are the risks? This cognitive laziness, as you suggest, is a real risk. We get it when we're scrolling through social media. Doom scrolling is exactly this. It's a bit like watching paint dry. You just kind of scroll through the stuff, and your brain takes a rest. Dangerous, very dangerous, because you suspend judgment and belief in certain things, and you tend to assume that the black box will sort it out. And that's another aspect of this, of course, is that we don't really understand how these things work anyway as lay people, and even frankly the AI experts. Their explanations are pretty opaque for the lay person. So we've always had this issue with black box solutions. A lot of my work historically was in retail location analysis. We use gravity modeling, spatial opportunity modeling, and so on to predict the best locations for stores. And one of the techniques that was advanced back in the late 90s was neural networks, which is an early version of AI. And no one trusted it because it was a black box. No one knew how it had reached the conclusions it reached. So you do a presentation to the board and they'd say, well, how do you know this? Where's the working? So if let's say you're doing a maths homework, you've got the question and the answer, but you don't know how you got from the question to the answer and what assumptions were kind of made in that process. And that's the worrying part of AI, is that the process automation renders it opaque to a human understanding, in effect, or a dimension. So you just have to say, well, does that, use your experience to say, does that answer feel about right? And that's a rather dangerous kind of attitude to take, I think. The necessary one.
Yeah, definitely. I know it can feel a little bit dystopian, but I think there's also a lot of exciting things happening
completely.
in that space as well. Jonathan, before I let you go, just briefly tell us, retailing in 2030, what will it look like? How different will it really be?
Well, the way I always answer these kinds of questions is we're now in 2026. It's 4 years' time. Go back 4 years. What was happening? Emerging from the pandemic. Everyone worried about the growth of e-commerce, the growth of social commerce, Temu, Shein. So 4 years' time, not so different. I mean, I don't see AI replacing store staff in 4 years. I do see some great efficiency gains. I do see some big disasters ahead for firms that don't take precautions. There'll be just like there are cyber attacks and kind of technology failures. The Wi-Fi's gone down. There's going to be an AI apocalypse in some organization because they weren't careful enough so they'll order too much ice cream or something. I don't know. In middle of December or whatever. And no one will question it because the AI said order ice cream. So there'll be a larger version of that, I suspect. So it'd be easy for me to say, well, yes, of course, by 2030, the whole place will be transformed. We're net zero. We'll be completely sustainable. We'll all be shopping with our eyes, through our heads-up displays and our glasses. Or some of us will have brain implants. Sure. There's this great quote from a science fiction author that says that the future is already here. It's just very widely distributed. It's William Gibson. What that basically means is if you look carefully enough, you'll find the seeds of the future somewhere already. But the challenge is knowing which is the right seed to pick on. So that's probably hedging the bets with our academic message on the fence on a lot of these things. But I do think that we will see some significant advances in AI. We'll also see some significant mistakes being made. I think we'll see the AI bubble burst a bit, if not wholly, by then. And if we think about the models of these, what you said to see the Gartner hype cycle is we get terribly, terribly excited about stuff. And then we go into what's called the trough of disillusionment, and everyone says, well, I told you that was wrong. I told you that would never work. Just disasters. And then a few companies, kind of plucky companies, stick with it. And over the years, develop something that generates real strategic advantage. So I think rather than say what 2030 be like, it's saying who will be the winners in 2030? Where can you already see the attitudes to innovation, to transformation, to leadership? And those, I think, for example, companies like Next and Marks and Spencer, Simon Wolfson at Next, I'd bet money on him to be a dominant player still in 2030, because of his track record in innovation and commercialization of ideas and following through and so on. But also his careful minding of the shop, So I think it's some business as usual, but it's also some strategic innovation by firms that we can already identify as being successful. And then there'll be a few wildcards, coming in, the TikTok shops and so on. There'll be a few wildcards. So there'll probably be an AI store somewhere that we already have instant checkout that OpenAI has developed in the States. That'll probably spread around, where you can use your agent to do your shopping for you. So I'm sure we'll have at least one player that will start to try and dominate the automated consumer agent dealing with retailer agent kind of intermediary. And that'll be interesting, I think, to see.
Yeah, no, I think you've summed it up really well. And I am personally really excited about agentic commerce, a little bit skeptical, a little bit nervous, but I think that is something that is not 10 years off. I mean, that is happening now in the US, as you say. And
in our business school,
whether we like it or not.
In our business school, we have a thing called the Grand Automation Project, which is basically allowing our junior staff, we have OpenAI licenses for all our staff here. And we say to them, go and build an agent to do something that will help improve your work. We've already got 20 agents in the last month that do all kinds of things, checking contracts, all the boring stuff, you don't even have to do, that streamlines some of these processes. Sure, it's got the human agent at the end, and lots of health warnings about that. But the enthusiasm amongst some of my colleagues, the teams, for making their lives better and easier is phenomenal. And I think we shouldn't neglect that. This is not a matter for specialist AI designers sitting in ivory tower somewhere. It's for all of us, and I think it's a democratization of technology that this represents, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and it will level a playing field as well. I think that's the other exciting thing here.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Jonathan, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast. Always great to see you. And thank you again for your time and your insights.
Not at all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.